Welcome back everyone to the React in-depth YouTube series. In this video, what I'd like to do is go over a bunch of exercises on the useEffect hook that we just learned about in React together. In the previous video, we saw a bunch of the theory as to how the useEffect hook actually works and kind of the things that it allows us to do in regards to side effects in React. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises, Warmup, as well as 3 exercises to really make sure we can hammer in those concepts. And we're going to be mixing useState and useEffect together. And this is going to start to feel much more like a real application, and it's going to allow us to do a lot of really cool things. So without further ado, let's get to the exercises together. Okay, so as with the previous videos, I have this set of exercises up on GitHub. So if you prefer to kind of clone that down and work through it that way, that's all there. Or you can just kind of walk through the videos with me and pause, and I'll give you an opportunity to do so you can actually try it yourself before we go through a solution together. So for this warm-up exercise, what I'd like you to do is create a new React project. And again, I'll just say this for every single one because it is pretty important. Feel free to reuse that React project for every single exercise here. You don't have to actually create a new one for each one. You can kind of just switch out the components. But I just left that in there in case you want to do each one independently. So for this warm-up, what I want you to do is create a counter.jsx with a counter component inside it that you can export. I'm going to get a bit more concise with these instructions because I think by the time you get to these exercises, hopefully you're kind of got the rote memory going and more familiar with kind of how we're creating a component and exporting it, and it returns JSX. So I'll try to shorten those bits and focus on the more important parts as much as possible without losing too much context. So anyways, in this counter component, what I want you to do is have an H1 as well as a button. And the H1 is going to display a counter, which is going to be state, and it's going to start at the number 0. So the point of this, as with a lot of these demos, when you start looking at React for the first time, it's going to be a relatively simple component. You click the button and the number is going to go up. So it's going to go from 0 to 1 to 2. If you want to be fancy, you can make it go up by larger numbers, as long as there's some state that is causing the component to re-render. So make sure that that's working. If you're struggling with that one, definitely take a look at useState first, because that is an exercise we go through together for the useState hook. Now, the goal of this exercise is to practice useEffect. So what I want you to do is think about how you would add a useEffect hook in order to kind of do these 2 sets of logs. The first log, console log, is I want you to console log out component mounted only when the component mounts into the DOM. And again, for those of you that haven't seen the previous videos, the terminology for mounting means when that component first gets inserted into the DOM and we can see it visually for the very first time, but that's it, right? Just when it gets added for the very first time. Now, as we'll see, the tricky thing is when we're in dev mode with modern React, I think like 18 plus or something, they actually mount it twice, like quote unquote mount it twice, and we'll have to see this probably logged twice, but that's okay. The main thing is that the state shouldn't actually cause this to run again. So that said, we want another console log to run when the counter state's changed. So we were going to log out counter state change, but only when the counter state changes. Okay. Now, as a byproduct, this is also going to run when the component mount, as you'll see, but we should only see the first log component mounted when the component first mounts and is inserted into the DOM for the first time. And we should see counter state change only when this button is clicked and the counter actually goes up by 1. Okay. And then import that into your main.jsx if you're using Vite, and replace the app in there by default and test to make sure that it actually works in the browser. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through a solution together. All right, so I'm going to create a new Vite project over here. I'm going to run npm create Vite at latest. And that's going to ask me to create a project name. I'll just call this useEffect. And I'll do React, I'll do JavaScript. I'll cd into my useEffect folder, and I'll run npm install. And while that's installing, I'm going to open up all these folders here. I'm also going to create a exercise 1 folder in the source, just so I can separate these out, just so it's a bit more clear. So I'll just call, or in this case, I'll just say warm-up exercise. I'll just call it warm-up like that. And then I'll do EX1, EX2, EX3 for the other ones, just so we can separate out the components and it's a bit more clear. Okay, so that install is done. I'm going to run npm run dev to actually start running the dev server there. And I'm just going to I guess I'll just copy this. I'll switch over to Chrome, and I'm going to put this in here. For some reason, when I command click this recently, it's acting a bit weird. Maybe I can get that sorted out in the future. Now, I have my dev tools open here because I know I'm going to need that, and most importantly, my console as well over here so that I can actually see those logs coming through. So that's all set up nicely. I'm just going to close off my terminal here so we have more space. I'm going to create that counter.jsx in my warmup, counter.jsx. So in here, I know I want to have a function called counter, and I'm going to export that. So whenever you see me with those instructions, like kind of export a component, I'm going to do export default counter in this case. And that's pretty much all we need in there, right? So I'm going to return, I'm going to do some fragment in there. And I think I had an H1, and then I said a button. Okay, button, there we go. So I know that I need two different hooks. I need useState in here, and I also need useEffect. So I'm going to say import from React. And in here, I'm going to do useState and useEffect. Perfect. Now, I want to make sure that this H1 contains the counter in it. So I'm going to say const count, set count. Doesn't really matter what you call these as long as you're consistent with yourself. And this is going to use our state, and we're going to start it at 0. And I'm going to insert that count right over here in the H1. And the reason we need state here is so that when we actually change this number here using the set count, this function re-renders, and we can actually see that updated in the H1. And then on click, what I want this to do, I can do this inline or I can do it as a function. I don't really like doing things inline, but for the sake of this, I'll just keep it simple and just put it in here. And this is going to call set count to count +1. I also don't generally like using this syntax. I like to use a previous function callback syntax, but we'll kind of get practice with both of these just so we can see how that actually works. And I'll put some text in here. I'll just say go up. Oops, can't spell. Go up. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty good. And I'm just going to import that into my main.jsx. So I'm going to get rid of the index CSS here. I'm going to import, what was it, counter from Warmup, warmup/counter.jsx. I'm going to replace this with my counter over here. I'll switch back to my Chrome, and we can see that we have that. And then I click on this, and it does go up, which is really, really nice. So that all works quite nicely. Now, the point of this exercise was to actually make sure we have our useEffect working. So for the mounting, what we know is that we can run any code on a useEffect on mount if we give it an empty dependency array. This is telling React, hey, I would like you to execute this function, but only when the component first mounts. So in here, I'm going to do a console.log. I forgot what we're supposed to say. Component mounted. I'll just copy that there. We're going to do a component mounted. All right, so let's test that works. We should get 2 of these because we're running in dev mode, but that should be fine. I'm going to refresh my page here, and we indeed get, as we expect, component mounted. And most importantly here, when I click go up, which is the state change, we are not getting any more component mounted logs, which is exactly what we want. So this is just showing up in the DOM the first time. When I click on go up, the H1 is changing, but we're not remounting the entire counter component. Great. So that works fine. The other one we need is when our state changes. So this is pretty useful. I use this to kind of do some debugging here and there to make sure the state is what I think it is. So this is a good one to get used to. We want to know specifically when our count is being changed. Now, in this particular case, it might be okay to run a useEffect on every single re-render without any dependency array because we really only have one set of state here. But I would like to be really explicit with this one and say, hey, React, please only run this useEffect every time you see count change, which is the dependency to run this effect function on a re-render. So in this case, I'm going to do a console.log. And in here, I forget what I said here, counter state change. Let me just copy that. counter state change just like that. So this one is saying, hey React, please run this effect function, console log component mounted only on mount. And this one here is saying, hey React, please run the update or sorry, effect function only when count changes specifically. Now, just a caveat here before I switch to Chrome. This is also going to run on mount because if you really think about it, count is really quote unquote changing the first time. It's changing to 0, like it's being changed to 0 so that we render it to the screen the first time. So we are going to see this on mount as well. So let me switch over here. Let me reload the page and we should see component mounted and the counter state change. And we see 2 of those just because of how we're running this in dev mode right now. Now, most importantly though, when I click this go up button, we should only see counter state change. We should not see any the log for component mounted. And let's see if that's true. And there we go. And we can see that that's indeed going up, which is quite nice. There we go. That's it. That's the warm-up exercise. Now, keep this pattern in mind. It's very, very useful. You can this specific pattern right here where and when I say pattern, like kind of idea and concept and set of code where you're running an effect every single time like something changes, very, very useful to debug your code and to test when something is what you expect it to be if you're running into issues in your React component. What I'll sometimes see a lot of the time is people we'll do this, for example, just as an aside, like you might see console log count like in the actual updater function like this. This works. This is the same thing almost as kind of wrapping it in a useEffect, but with no dependencies. So this will run on every single re-render. The only thing is like it's more useful to know like when it actually changes because it's state. It's probably less useful to have it just every single re-render. If you have a lot of other state, you're going to get a lot of logs that are probably unnecessary. Just a little kind of tidbit there, pretty useful to know how to actually do that. Perfect. So that's the warm-up exercise. Hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 1. So for this exercise, again, you can reuse the V project that we have already or create a new one. And what I want you to do is create an interval JSX file with an interval component inside that you can export. I want you to add a state for a counter, which is a number as well as an H1 for the button. So very, very similar to what we just saw with our counter element that we did in our warm up. And the H1 is going to display the current counter starting at 0 when you click the button and increase the counter by 1. So all of that actually is the same. You're probably thinking, did you accidentally copy and paste the wrong thing into here? No, so there's a bit of a difference here with this one, and it actually makes it a bit tricky. So the next step though is once you have that working, I want you to figure out how would you set up a set interval with a 1 second repeat, right? So 1000 milliseconds to log out interval says hello only 1 time for this component. Okay, so like what I mean by that is that this interval should only set up 1 interval. I should probably rephrase this. It shouldn't be only 1 time. That would be a timeout. In this case, I should really emphasize that it should only be 1 interval for this component, and we should never ever set up another interval. So there should only be interval says hello being logged out once per second while this component is on the screen. Okay, so explicitly changing state and re-rendering this component should not create more or new intervals. Okay, that's kind of the hint for this one. And then import this into your main and actually test that this works to make sure that you have the correct behavior. Now this seems a bit trivial, but there is some trickery in here that you have to make sure you're aware of, and it'll introduce us to the other half of the useEffect concept, which if you saw the previous videos, you might be able to recall. So give that a shot and then see if you can get that working, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so I'm going to create a new folder here. I'll call this EX1. And to start, what I'll do is I'm actually just going to kind of copy. I don't like doing this, but I'm going to create a new folder or a new file. Sorry, I'll do interval.jsx. I'm going to paste all this in because a lot of this we're going to be reusing. I'm just going to remove the useEffects here, just so that you don't have to watch me like recode this particular part of it, because that part is the same, right? Where we're having a count and the count is going to be able to go up. And if I import this into my main, Let's do interval from interval. I guess I should probably actually leave these in here, and and I'll do import interval. Did I not export it? Interval, there we go. I was wondering why it wasn't auto-completing for me. VS Code is because it didn't actually know it was exporting it. There we go. Import interval, there we go, from ex1 interval.jsx, and then I can put my interval right here. And if I go back to Chrome, what we'll see is interval is not defined. So why am I getting that? Let me just double check interval, because right here, there we go, interval is not defined. That makes sense. So if I reload this, we have our counter working again. Okay, the perils of copying and pasting code. Generally why I don't like doing it, among many other reasons, but just to save you a little bit of time. Now we have the counter working, right? Now what we want to do is have, according to our instructions, interval says hello being logged out every 1 second, but we only want this interval to be set up one time, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means that if only one time kind of triggers in my mind, like, okay, probably on mount, right? So if I change this state, then I don't want it to be impacted, right? Because if I change the state, then it's going to cause a re-render. And if I was to, for example, set up a useEffect like this, and I just, and I don't really care about the dependency array, then this useEffect is going to run every single re-render. So if I set up an interval in here, that's going to create new intervals all the time, which is probably not what we want. So I probably want this to be on mount. And I want to make sure I only set up one of these. So let's think for a second. So let's just set the interval up. So I'm going to do setInterval. It's going to run this function. And we know we want to run it every 1 second, which is 1000 milliseconds. So just like that. And I always forget what I wanted to write in there. So I'm going to say, I'll do that. I'll say console.log interval says hello. Okay. Great. So that is probably what we want, right? So when the component mounts, set up this interval, set it at 1 second, and every 1 second log out interval says hello. Even if I click this button over here, which changes this state up here, which causes this H1 to re-render, this useEffect is not supposed to rerun because the dependency says only run on mount. So let me switch back to Chrome. I'll refresh the page and we should see interval says hello, but there's 2 of them being set up. You can see that it's kind of going up by numbers of 2. Okay, so something is a bit funky, and this has to do specifically with the fact that we're running in development mode in React. And also, this is a good chance for us to actually realize that this code is technically a bit buggy and incorrect. And the reason is that we need to actually make sure that we clean up after ourselves if we're running side effects that have impacts on other systems. Otherwise, we might run into things like memory leaks. So what is actually happening here is React is helping us by actually running this effect twice to make sure that we're doing that properly. And it's showing us that we're doing it wrong because it's going up by 2 each time. So we need a way to clean up after ourselves, because React is going in dev mode, not in production mode. In dev mode is going to mount and then unmount and then remount the component to make sure that we're doing this correctly, which means that we need to clean up this interval and make sure we're setting up an independent interval that is not impacted by anyone's previously. So the way that we do that is we need to clean up this interval. setInterval gives us an ID back, and we need to tell React to clean this effect up, or this interval up, which means that we're telling React, hey, if this component ever unmounts from the DOM, please would you run this cleanup effect function for us, which should actually, in this particular case, clean up after all of the work that we did previously if it needs to be cleaned up. In this case, we need to clear the interval, which is the cleanup equivalent for setInterval, for this effect. And other examples might be unsubscribing from subscriptions for like observables and things like that, or maybe like canceling fetch requests. All sorts of things like that are things that we should be thinking about and doing in our cleanup functions for our useEffect. So in this case, again, for this particular setInterval useEffect, we're going to return a function. And this function is going to execute when this component unmounts, and we want it to run this clear interval. Clear interval takes the ID of the interval that we set up. So what React is going to do in this case, it's going to set up the interval. We're going to get the ID back, some number, and it's going to, on unmount, clear that interval. And that way we have kind of the setup, the side effect, and then the cleanup for that side effect, and we're left with as if we never touched the system to some degree. So that's kind of the point, and this is kind of a functional programming concept that's very important, that we don't really leave any side effects behind. We clean up after ourselves, which is a very good thing to do. So React is going to mount this, set up an interval. It's going to unmount it to make sure that we do the cleanup, and we do in this case. Then it's going to remount it one more time, and we should only have one interval left. And let's see if that's true. So if I refresh this page, now I should see interval says hello, and this is indeed counting up by 1 each second instead of by 2 each second, which is the correct behavior. And this applies to everything, not just mounting and unmounting. It applies to all of our side effects. We should make sure that we clean them up if we are having impacts on external systems, such as this with intervals. All right. So now, before we go to the next exercise, what I want to show you is that even if I click this go up button, nothing happens because we have this specific hook is only going to run on mount, right? So clicking on this button is not going to be impacting that code. It's not going to execute that code to create more intervals. So we are good to go. We can safely manage our state in our application, no matter how much other state that we have, and we can be rest assured that this is only going to be the single interval that is going to run for this particular component. Perfect. Hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 2. All right, so this one is got a bit more going on, so we're going to ramp it up a little bit. So hopefully you have yourself warmed up. For this one, again, create a new project if you haven't already, or reuse the existing Vite project that we have seen so far together. I'd like you to create 2 files for this one. A home.jsx and a section.jsx, and export the respective components in there with their names, home and section. In home, I'd like you to create state and put an h1 in there that says visits, like the string visits, and then has room for a number after it, just like this, and then a button as well. So not too different from our counter component. You can put any text in the button, like the plus, for example. I think I forgot to put that in the other ones. When we click the button, we should increase the number of visits in the h1, just like a counter. So really, this is just it's a different way of thinking about a counter. If we click the button, it's going to make the visits go up instead of the counter go up, right? So it should go like visits 1, visits 2, if you're doing it up by 1 each time. All right, so that's almost the exact same. In fact, I'll probably copy my code just so we can go through that one a bit faster for the counter. Now, here's where it's different though. I want you to create this in the second component, the section component, to add state to that one as well. This one should return an h2 with a timer in it for how long the user has been on that page for in seconds. So for example, that h2 should look something like this. It should display 1 second for time on page, and then time on page 2 seconds, etc., and it should just keep counting up on its own without any interaction from the user. Okay, now when you have that section created, add the section component to the home component right at the end, right below the h1 and the button. So the home is going to have an h1, the button to change the visits, and then the section right below that should have the time counting up. Now, what I want you to also do is put a useEffect that runs on every single re-render inside both home and section that says that the component has re-rendered, right? So on every single re-render, which means no dependencies. And that should say home has re-rendered for the home, and section has re-rendered respectively for the section. Okay. Now what I want you to do, the goal of this exercise, and I implore you to really try this without seeing the results and try to predict this and then test your theory by actually looking at the console to see if you're correct. Try to predict how or when the log and use effect in the home and section components will be triggered based on the state and mounting. So what I mean by that is try to like guess when we will see home has re-rendered and section has re-rendered and how many times we'll see it and kind of when we'll see it. And go back and to the console and check if you're right. And then actually change some states inside of home, for example, by clicking on the visits counter, and then see if your theory is still correct and you still know kind of which of these is actually going to trigger and when. Okay, now there's a lot going on with this example. It's definitely a bit more complicated, and the purpose of this is really to get comfortable with the idea of kind of component composition and the re-rendering of components and kind of the tree structure that we should have in the back of our minds. So this is definitely a bit complex. Take your time with this one and maybe even just write it down if you need to, and do your best. And if you get it wrong, that's fine. It's actually quite complex. But the main thing is that once you actually finally see the solution, hopefully it does make sense to you. So once you have that all ready, import it into your main.jsx and replace the app. And the hint here, now that we've seen cleanup functions, you may or may not need that. Okay, so I'm give it a shot and then we'll go through it together. I'll create my exercise 2 folder here. And in here, I'm going to create my 2 home and section.jsx. I'll create a new home.jsx, and then I'll create a section.jsx. And inside home, I'll do function home, and I will export default home. And inside of section, function section, export default section. Section. There we go. Okay. Now, in home, we want the visits and kind of all that text. So I'm just going to probably do that really quick here. So I'll say import from React. This is going to be use state. Do not use state, and that's a fun one, by the way. If you ever look that up on GitHub, it's quite a funny stories on there. Use state, use effect, and we're going to do const count, or I'll do in this case visits. I don't want to keep with the theme. Set visits, if I can spell, and this is going to be use state, and we're going to start it at 0, and we want to return. I'll do some fragments here, and I'll put this inside an h1, and I'll put visits in here. And again, spelling is really hard. And I'll put a button below that, and this is just going to have a plus in there. I always forget the ampersand one. I think it's plus, but it doesn't matter too much for this exercise. I'll say on click. I'll just do this in line. You know what, I'll do it slightly differently just so we can see something a bit different here. I'll say function like visits go up. It's funny, I don't know why I called it that, but let's go with that one. And we want our visits to go up by 1, so we're going to say set visits, and I'll just use the alternative syntax just so you can see the difference here. I'll just say prev visits, like for previous visits, and I want to do previous visits plus 1. Okay, not necessary in this case, but it's just kind of nice to know that is like, you'll see me use this once in a while, and it's pretty handy syntax to have. So we don't actually need to directly refer to visits. We can grab it in this callback function here. Now in here, I want to call visits go up, and that's pretty much good to go there. Now we're going to leave some space here for our section, and that's going to come next. So let's come to our section component here. And I'm going to do some imports here. Import use state and use effect. Great. Now let me switch back to my exercise. Let's see what we need to do. So I think that we have this working. So let's test that we have this working really quick just to make sure that actually is working. If I go to my main.jsx and then I import, what did I call it? Home from exercise 2 home.jsx, and I switch this out to be home, just like that, and I'll comment this one out. If I switch back here, what we'll see is indeed our counter, and that looks a bit boring, so I'm just going to add my visits tag here. I don't know why I struggle for spelling that so much, but there we go. Visits, it's going to go up. Perfect. Okay, now the challenge here is this component and kind of making it work in sync with our home component and actually predicting how these use effects are going to run. So before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put inside the home component, I'm going to put that every single re-render use effect. So every single re-render means a use effect with no dependencies. This is going to run on mount and then on every single update for every single state that changes when this JSX needs to be re-rendered. So I'm going to put console.log and I'm going to say home has re-rendered. There we go. And we can test that, right? So if I refresh this page, we should see the mount, and then we should see home has re-rendered for every single time I click that button, which makes sense. So this is pretty much done. We just need to add our section once we're done with that. So let's just go back to our instructions really quick. I want it so that in our section.jsx, we return an h2 that has a timer in it for how long the user has been on that page. And it should say something like time on page, like 1 second in this case. Okay, so let's come in here. And I'm going to create const, let's call it time set time. And this is going to be a use state, and I'll set it to 0 to start. And I'm going to return, in this case, it's just gonna be h1, so I'll just put it in line like this. And I'm going to put in here, I already forget what we're supposed to say. Short-term memory, time on page, I'm just gonna copy this because I'm not gonna remember that. I'm just going to put time on page, and then I'm going to replace the one here with my state, time seconds. All right, cool. So that's good. We don't have a way to change this yet, so we'll look into that for a second shortly. But I'm going to just import this into my home. So I'm going to say import section from the current folder section, and then I'm going to add .jsx here. Always have the extension if you're importing from a file locally. And I'm going to put that section right down here, right after the button. So I'll put section here. I'll go with this syntax here because it's just a bit shorter. There we go. So there's our section. So if I reload this page here, we can see that we have home has re-rendered, time on page 0 seconds, and then this plus is going to make our home has re-rendered use effect run. Perfect. So that's good. So we're almost set up here. Now, the only thing is we need to make sure that this time goes up when every second, right? So let's think about this. What does this mean? This means that every 1 second, we need to change this state time to 1, and then to 2, and then to 3, etc. So we need probably an interval, sounds right, where we're going to set up the interval to call set time every 1 second. And we only want this to happen one time, because if we have too many set intervals set up, we're going to run in a situation where it's going to just keep calling set time a whole bunch of times, and we only want it to be called one time. So very similar to how we wanted to make sure that we only had it called one time in our previous exercise, we need to do the same thing here. So I'm going to say useEffect. I'm going to create a useEffect here just so I don't forget really quick to make sure that I have the every single re-render console.log. I'm going to say section has re-rendered. So just so I don't forget that one there. So that one is just so that we can see when that's going to run. And then I'm going to create another useEffect here. And this is going to be for setting up our interval. Now, I just mentioned I want that to only run on mount. So I'm going to give this a dependency array, unlike this one, because I wanted this to run every single re-render. Technically, in this case, I could have just added time as well, because that is the only state in this case. But this is probably more correct in this case for every re-render. But this one has to be special. This useEffect on mount, we need to make sure that it has a set interval. And this set interval is going to call this function every 1 second. And what is it going to do? Well, it's going to call setTime, and it's going to take the current time, and it's going to do +1. Okay, I'm going to use the new syntax just so we can see that. We're going to say previous time, and we're going to say it's going to take the previous time, and it's going to go up by 1. Okay, so that is what we want it to do. So if you haven't seen the syntax before, we see it briefly as to why this is useful in the exercises for useState. This is just an alternative here where we can just get access to the previous state, basically. So this is basically just time right here, but it's updated in cases where we call this multiple times or in other kind of exceptional cases. So we are saying change the time to be the previous time, but add 1 to it. So it's going to go from 0, and then it's going to, so we're going to get 0, and then 0 plus 1, then we're going to get 1. After another second, it's going to be 1, and then 1 plus 1, and we're going to get 2, etc., 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 every 1 second. Okay, so we should see time on page is going to be 0 seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds, etc. And we should also see section as re-rendered, every single re-render, every single time time changes. Wow, that's a lot, tongue twister. Okay, I'm going to switch back here, and I'm going to refresh the page. So I'm going to refresh the page, and okay, so you might notice something already is a little bit weird, right? We have kind of an issue, which is that the time is not going up by 1 second. The time is going up by 2 seconds. Now, why is this? Why is this? I want you to think why this is. Okay, so you might have caught it. The reason is because React in dev mode is actually mounting our component twice. It's mounting, unmounting, and then remounting the component. We are not cleaning up our set interval. Okay, so I can show that to you by doing a console.log in here, and I'll say running our interval. Okay, and I'll refresh this page here. And what we'll see is we're going to see running our interval happen 2 times, right? It's going to happen 2 times because we have 2 intervals running because we never cleaned up our first interval that React is checking for in dev mode, at least on mount. So we can fix this by running a cleanup function. So I'm just going to comment that one out. And the way that we clean this up, we saw in the previous exercise, we're going to grab the ID for this. And I'm going to say, I'm going to return a function here, which is going to clear that interval for that ID. Great. Now that'll fix that. Now that that's fixed, I know this is fixed just based on the logic that we have. So I'm hesitant to switch back because I want us to think, what are we going to see logged out? Okay, so now assuming everything is set up correctly, I want you to think for a second. We are mounting our home component. Okay. And this is extremely important, actually. Like, I think that if you can walk yourself through explaining this and like literally spend time sitting there and explaining in depth, or even writing it down, talking in the mirror, talking to your computer, talking to someone else, whatever happens to be, of exactly what is happening with these 2 components, that goes a long, long way. So let me kind of give an attempt at that, and then we'll see if we're correct. So we have a home component. And this home component, the first thing I like to do is look at the JSX. So what's the JSX doing? So in this case, it's returning an H1. Okay, well, this H1 has visits in here. Well, let's take a look. Where is that coming from? Where's visits coming from? Oh, okay, it's up here. It's coming from state. So I know that every time set visits is going to be called, that we're actually going to have to re-render this entire home function. So I'm going to keep that back in my mind. Okay, then I have a button here. And it's on click, and it's going to call this visits go up function. So what is that? And we saw that that is the one that calls sets visits. So lo and behold, we know that when you click this button, it's going to cause this entire component, top to bottom, to re-render. And we're going to get some new state based on that. So in this case, the visits are going to go up. Now, we saw previously in set state that when we re-render a parent component, the child component also needs to re-render. All right, so by default. So what does that mean for us? That means that we have section in here as well, which is an actual React component. So if I click on this button, and I change visits, not only do I have to re-render our home component to get this new visits, but in the process of doing that, I have to re-render section because that's part of this JSX over here. So I'm going to be re-rendering section every single time I click on this button. Okay, so what does that mean for us in the context of logs inside of home? Well, we have home as re-rendered being changed every single re-render. When does home re-render? Well, home is going to re-render on mount, and then every single time visits changes, which is going to be every single time we click this button, right? So every single time I click the plus button, it's going to run this useEffect, and also on mount, it's going to run this useEffect. Okay. Now let's take a look at section. Section is a child component of home, and it's going to re-render as a result of home re-rendering, which means both on mount and every single time the button gets clicked inside of home. So let's take a look at section here. Let's go down to JSX, take a look at it. We have time on page, time seconds. Okay, so it's just a relatively simple component. It has time in there. What is time? Well, oh, cool. Time is a state. So that means every time set time is being called, we are going to re-render our section component. So let's take a look at where is set time being called. Well, it's not being called here. This useEffect is just going to log section as re-rendered every single re-render. Is it being run here? Yeah, it is. It's being run right here, right? So in this useEffect, we are setting up an interval that is going to run every single second. And this is being set up on mount because of our empty dependency array. And it's going to take the previous time and add 1 to it. So this is actually going to run every single second starting on mount of this component, which is the same time that home is going to mount because it's a child of home. And it's going to not only set up the interval, but it's going to clear the interval as its cleanup, which is the correct thing to do. So this component is going to change time every single second, which is a state, which is going to cause itself to re-render every single second that this is called right here. So section, we should see this section has re-rendered every single time that time changes, which is every single second, as well as on the very first mount that it gets mounted into the DOM. However, we also just mentioned that section is going to re-render when home re-renders. And the same rules apply that we just mentioned for home. Any of those re-renders that re-renders home is also going to re-render section. So what does that mean? Well, that means if we click on our visits go up function and change our visits, we should also see section has re-rendered. We're going to see this every second because of set time, but every single time I click the button, we should also see it because the child component is going to re-render. Okay, cool. So let's see if that's true. That was a lot of yapping and you've probably been itching. Just, I want to see crow, I want to see the logs, I want to see for right. So let's go back here. I'm going to refresh the page here. And what we're going to see is, first of all, I'd like you to notice that this is now fixed, right? We're seeing it go up by 1 every single time. Let's take a look at the logs that we have so far. So we have section has re-rendered, home has re-rendered. Interesting. So section was kind of mounted, I guess, and then home was mounted. We see that 2 times, right? Because of how React is running this in dev mode to make sure that it's working correctly. Then we see section has re-rendered, and we're seeing this log the same amount of times that we actually have our time changing because this is in an interval. So these 4 up here are coming from the mount, and in production mode, it would just be the 2. And this one is happening every single second that the state for time is changing, which is this state right here. Okay, so that's pretty nice. Now, the test is, what are we going to see when we click on this plus button and change visits to go up, which is the parent component home, which is also going to cause section to re-render. I expect both home has re-rendered and section has re-rendered to show up like one after the other, right? Because we're re-rendering both the parent and the child. Let's see if that's true. I'm going to click it. Section has re-rendered, home has re-rendered, right? And then we still have our interval set up and it's still ticking away as usual with no changes. So if I click this a whole bunch of times, you can see that indeed we do get those logs logged out as we expect for both of them re-rendering, and then our interval continues ticking down there. Perfect. So hopefully that one makes sense. As you can probably see now, there's quite a lot going on in React behind the scenes. It definitely seems like a relatively trivial example, right? We only have 2 sets of state, 2 different components. Well, like how complicated could this possibly be? But really, if you can understand this example, and really walk through how these logs are coming through and actually explain it not only to yourself, but even maybe someone else, that is like super gold standard in my opinion, right? So yeah, not only does that help your own understanding, but it makes you more confident when you're working with React and on a team with other people to help them out if things go wrong. And these are things that happen all the time when it comes to bugs and issues. So if you can understand this process, it really helps fixing those in the future. Okay, cool. So that is exercise 2. Hopefully that one was fun for you. Let's take a look at the third and final exercise for this video. Now this one's a bit fun, also quite challenging. We're going to be working with the Pokemon API, and I'll pull that up in a second. But let's take a look at how this one works. So again, you can reuse the existing Vite project or create a new one. Create a Pokemon.jsx file, return and export a Pokemon component, just one component in this case, a little bit easier for that part. In the Pokemon component, I'd like you to return an H1 tag with the text Mankey, not monkey, but Mankey, an awesome Pokemon inside, or you can really choose your own if you really want to. You just got to change something else a bit later, as well as an empty image tag below it. Okay, so no source to start, just totally empty. Now, my question to you and the point of this exercise is basically this step right here, step number 4. Okay, how and where would you make a fetch request to the API listed right here? So you can copy this or just write it down and copy it, which is going to grab the information for the Mankey Pokemon as a JSON object from this API. I encourage you to use the fetch API for this. And if you haven't seen that before, I have a video on the JavaScript series as to how that works. You don't need any extra libraries to do any of this. So just use the regular fetch API to do this and everything should work as expected. I want you to figure out how to make a request to this in order to get the image of Mankey in this case, or whichever Pokemon you choose, to show up in the image tag. Okay. To make it look nice, there's an original artwork section somewhere in that very large JSON object where there's a front default key in the original artwork section, or you can just use any of the other sprites in there for the image. And then import it into your main.jsx and then test to make sure that the image actually does show up in your browser. Now, some hints for you here. You'll need to use both useState and useEffect to make this work. As a bonus, if you're interested to kind of elaborate on this, if you like, just to get more practice, there's other data in that JSON object and from the API. You can definitely fill in more information dynamically coming from the API other than the image, for example, the stats like the HP and the defense and things like that. And if you want to get more practice, definitely try that out and see if you can get that working. But it's all based on the concept of pulling data out of that object. So again, the goal of this is to have an H1 with Mankey in it that you're going to hard code. Again, you can change this later on if you like. The image tag, which is going to be empty to start, but when the component loads up, it should actually make a request out to this API to actually get the data for that link for the source for that image. So give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'm super excited for this one. I love working with third-party APIs. It just makes things a little bit more exciting. Not that things aren't exciting already, but I like visuals. Visuals are nice. I'm going to create a new Pokemon.jsx. And in here, I'm going to say function Pokemon, and I'm going to export, oops, my goodness, export default Pokemon. And I'm also going to import my useState and useEffect since I know I'm going to use those. So I'm going to say import useState and useEffect. I'm using a bit of shortcuts here from VS Code just to help me out a bit, just to speed things up. There we go. So we have our Pokemon. And what I want to do in here is I want to return some JSX. And in here, I'm going to put an H1. And in here, I was going to hard code Mankey. And I'm going to put an empty IMG tag. All right. Now, that's pretty much it for this one. I'm going to switch over to my main and just import that to make sure we actually get that working. So I'm going to say import Pokemon from exercise 3 Pokemon.jsx, and I'm going to switch home here to Pokemon. And if I switch back here to my Chrome, I should see Mankey showing up, which is really nice. Now, I'm going to go to Google really quick, and I'm going to show you this Poke API. So if you go to Google, you search for Poke API, you'll see this right here. And let me just zoom in on this as well. You can see right here that you can try the API out. So for example, this is a request for searching for Ditto, which is a Pokemon. And there are many other things you can search for. And then this is kind of the structure of the link for specifically for Ditto, right? So you can switch this to, for example, Mankey, or Pikachu, Charizard, whatever Pokemon you like. And you'll get those results down here as a preview in JSON. So if you, again, haven't seen JSON before, definitely check out the JavaScript series. I have some examples on promises, the fetch API, and things like that on there to help out with that. But just use the fetch API for this. Again, you don't need any third-party tools or libraries. So we're going to get back JSON. It looks like this. I'm just going to kind of close all these just so we can take a look at that. So it's going to have this structure, and zoom in a little bit more on that. And in here, we can see that we have sprites, which is one of the keys. I'll zoom in even further. Sprites. And inside of sprites, we have a whole bunch of images. So for example, if I open up this back default image and I open that up, we'll see, look at that. That's the back of Mankey right there. Beautiful. Look at that tail. And if I go to the other section, again, inside sprites, there is this official-artwork section where we also have front default and front shiny. Okay, so this really, if you think about it, is the SRC value, the attribute for the image tag. So if we were to set that to be the source of our image tag, we would actually see like Mankey's image show up on our website, which is pretty cool. But we want to do this dynamically. We want to figure out how to grab this in our React code without hard coding this inside our component. So I could copy and paste this right here into the source, right? But that's probably not a good way to go if we have an API for this, because I want to be able to make this eventually work for all types of Pokemon, and I want to be able to dynamically grab this information when this component loads up. So let's think about this. What are the steps we need to do in order to make this work? When this component loads up, I want it to basically go out to this Pokemon API, make a fetch request to this Pokemon API. So let me write these down. One, on mount. I'll just put that in there just so it's a bit clear what we're doing. Go fetch Mankey from the API. Okay, Mankey from API. All right, 2. Then what do I need to do? Well, I need to get the, I guess, URL for the image from the JSON response. Then what do I need to do? Well, once I have that URL, I can set the source value of our image to that URL. So then it's set the SRC of our IMG to that URL. And then we want to, for re-render our component with the new image. Now I'm putting for in here. We don't really need to write and be that detailed, but just so that you see this word re-render, right? If you think about it, that's a pretty important one in the context of this particular case. So what I want to do is make it so the source of this image is reliant on something that's going to cause it to re-render, and it's also something that I can set later on in the future. So that means whenever I'm thinking like, oh, I want this to be like an attribute of this or some kind of text value of this, and I want to make sure it's in sync with the state of this component, you want to think of useState, right? Because it's in our JSX, it's in our DOM, and I want to make sure that changing its value is going to correctly update in the attributes in the DOM as well, so that every time I change it, I know for sure that the DOM has been reflecting those new changes. So I need some state. So I'll put that up here. I'll say const src, set src, you can call this whatever you like, I'll just go with that, is equal to useState, and I'll set it as an empty string to start. Okay, and I can set my src attribute on this actual image tag to dynamically refer to this value right here. So I'll save this and I'll switch back to Chrome just to show you what this is doing. So if I go back to my project, we can see that nothing has really changed. I'll go to my Elements tab, I'll open up my app component, and we can see that src is on there, but it's not referring to anything. In this case, I believe the HTML parser, or in this case, the DevTools, is just stripping it out, right? So for example, if I was to set this to hello, and I go back to Chrome, we can see that it's just referring to hello, which doesn't mean anything. So we're getting kind of a blank image. Okay, so that's what that's doing. So our goal is to eventually call setSource when we have the information for that URL, so that this changes to something else. Okay, so I'll change this back from hello to just an empty string, just so we don't see the missing image tag to start. So we're going to create a useEffect on mount. So that's what I'm doing right here. On mount, go fetch Mankey from the API. Okay. And I need the API URL really quick. So I'm going to grab that from here. I can also go and grab it from here, which is right here. So this URL right here, I can grab that, or I can grab it from the exercises. And I'll switch back to my Pokemon component. And I'm going to put this out here. I'm going to say const URL equals that. And I should probably put that in quotes. Now, really quick, before I go to making our useEffect, you're probably thinking, hey, Nader, like, why are you making this just a regular const, right? And why are you putting it up here? And why is it not a state? And all these other kinds of questions. So let's think about that, because it's a very, very important question as we're going through this. So bear with me as we start coding this out, and you'll see kind of why. In fact, we could actually probably put this inside of the useEffect, and I'll show you the differences as to why you put it outside and why you put it inside, also why I put it in all caps in a second. Now, I want to go and make a fetch request to this URL. And I am going to, I don't really like using the .then syntax for the promises and stuff like that, because I just like to read things synchronously. So I'm going to make this an async function in here, just so I can use await inside. So you don't have to watch me nest my .thens. So I'm going to say const, I guess we'll say response equals to await. And I'm going to call fetch. And I'm going to fetch my URL. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to console.log that response. And I'm going to do this on mount. All right. So there's a lot going on here. So let me just kind of slow this down for a second, just so we're all on the same page. I want this useEffect to run when this component mounts in the DOM for the first time, hence the empty dependency array. So it's going to execute this function when the component mounts. What does this function do? Well, it's going to reach out to the API. It's going to make a fetch request. We should see that in our network tab. And then it's just going to log out the response. So let's see if that works. So I'm going to switch to my console, and I'm going to refresh this page, and I get an error saying, what is the error? useEffect must not return anything besides a function which is used for cleanup. Return a promise instead, rewrite the async function inside. Oh, yes. So this is actually a good one. I made a mistake as I was rushing through this. So technically, an async function, this is probably good that we're seeing this, is actually going to return a promise, right? Now, useEffect doesn't like that, because useEffect expects a function to be returned, as we just saw, that's a cleanup function. It doesn't expect a promise to be returned, which is what async returns by default. It's actually being quite helpful here, this error message. It's saying, it looks like you return a promise and you want to do some async stuff in here. So what you can instead do is this kind of pattern right here, where instead of just passing the async function directly to useEffect, you can create that function inside of useEffect and just call it in there. Now this is a little bit kind of React wonkiness and just some runaround, but we'll go with that because you know, I kind of get why they want us to do that. So what they're saying is basically say create the function in here. It could be a function or arrow function, doesn't really matter. And I'll say function get Pokemon. And then in here, we're going to take this code and just kind of move it in here. Okay, and this is going to be an async function, just like that. Okay, and I'm going to remove async keyword from the useEffect right here. And instead, I'm just going to call get Pokemon here. Okay, that is what they're asking us to do. And the reason is that useEffect expects a cleanup function to be returned, not a promise to be returned, which is what async functions do by default. So we create a function in here, get Pokemon. We're going to call that function, which is going to execute this code, and it's going to run it on mount. Now we have to be careful because it's going to run twice. Actually, it's going to run, it's going to mount, unmount, and then mount. So we're actually going to see probably 2 requests. So let's see if that is what we see. I'm going to reload this page, and we have 2 responses showing up. But take a look at this, right? If I open up this response, we'll see that this is actually a response, right? A response object. The data is not in here because we know that this is a JSON object, so we need to pass it through the JSON, like the JSONification function for the response API. And if you're confused about that, again, you can check out the Fetch API video. But this is actually working, right? So to confirm this, I'm going to open up my network tab and I'm going to reload this tab here. And what we're going to see is that the first request is going to go and grab kind of an empty document. And if I look at that, this is the document that it ends up getting, which is our source, which is the React runtime. So we can ignore that for now. Then in here somewhere, we should see a fetch request for Mankey right here. And we see 2 of them, right? Mankey right here, we get back all this response, and Mankey right here, and we get back the same response. So it's actually sending 2 of these requests out to the API, which may or may not be an issue depending on how this works. And we can actually do things to fix this later on. And this is kind of the issue with data fetching in useEffects. And we will see potential solutions to this in future videos. Okay, so let's one step at a time. Let's figure out what we're going to do here. So async function get Pokemon. So we're going to get that Pokemon. We're going to get that response. Await fetch URL. We have that response, but we need to turn it into JSON. So I'm going to say const JSON equals await response.json, and this is just coming from the Fetch API. Then I'm going to console.log out that JSON, and I'll save this really quick. Switch back here. I'll take a look at my console. And we indeed actually see that JSON object, which is super, super awesome. So let's break this down and see what we need in here. We need to go into that JSON object. We need to go into sprites. We need to go into, I think it's other. And then inside other, we need to go into official artworks. And then I'm going to grab that URL right there for front_default. Now, keep in mind, official -artworks is a bit troll of them. I don't know why they didn't do underscore here. Maybe just to practice with the different indexing here in languages like JavaScript, but we'll deal with that shortly. So cool. So we have the JSON. Now, what we want to do is I'm going to say const image URL is equal to, and I'm going to say JSON, which is an object, right? This is the actual JavaScript object that comes back. And we want to go into sprites. So I'm going to say .sprites. And then we want to go into other. So I'm going to say .other. Then we want to go into official-artwork. And this is the part I was saying it's a bit troll. So we can't do official-artwork, right? Because there's a dash in here, which is not allowed when you're using the dot syntax. So the way that we need to do this part is we need to say official-artwork like that to index into it. So other @official artwork, right? Because the dash is not allowed. So it's a bit tricky with the indexing here. And then we need to go one further down, which is front_default, which is we can use. So we're going to say .front_default. There we go. Wow, that was a lot. So we're saying go into JSON, go into the sprites property, grab that value, go into other property, grab that value, go into official artwork property, grab that value, go into front default, grab that value, which finally is this string right here. So let's see if that's true. Let's console log that out, img URL, and we'll save that. And I'm going to refresh this page and look at that, right? We actually get this URL. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to not click this. I'm hesitating because I want the surprise to show up when we finally see our Mankey show up on the screen without seeing the picture first. But that, if we set this value as our image source, which is our empty image right here, what we should see is Mankey show up on the screen. Okay, so let's see if that's true. So now we need to just do so we did step 1, we fetched Mankey. We did step 2, we got the URL for the image from JSON. Now we need to do step 3, which is set the source of our image tag to that URL. And for us, since that is actually as state, it's actually going to do step 3 and 4 at the same time. So what does that mean? Well, now that we have this image URL, we need to set the source, which is the set state function for our src variable, to be that img URL that we just got back, right? That value right here. Now I'm going to save that, and I'm going to switch back, and look at that. We get Mankey on the screen, shouting out at us. That's pretty awesome. I love that pose. That's pretty cool, right? So if I go back to elements and I look at our div and I look at the image source, you can see that that source has indeed changed to be that entire long string from that URL, which is dynamically coming from the URL. So if that changed in the future, or if that URL changed on their backend, our code would still work correctly. Okay, so that's pretty awesome, right? That's it. That's this exercise. That was a long one. There's a lot going on in here, and actually there are some issues with this code. Most importantly, that we're actually running this function twice on mount, so we're doing 2 fetch requests. And there are ways to fix this. There's ways to fix it kind of without any libraries. Most people for data fetching like this will use libraries to solve problems like this and other problems like caching and things like that. But it's important to kind of know how this actually works without any of those external tools, just so you can get a start on it. And we'll actually see strategies to actually fix this and some other issues in future videos when we look at things like data fetching in isolation. So that is that component. And just to wrap this up, I'll just go through this start to finish and mention also what URL is doing and why I kind of coded it this way. I didn't put this URL as state because I am not using this URL anywhere down here in the JSX, right? If I don't need it in the render, it shouldn't be in the state, right? This value is not going to change. Nothing is going to like set URL. It's a hard-coded value. And usually hard-coded constant values like that, you'll put in all uppercase. That's kind of a tradition. So people know that that's kind of like a constant, but you don't have to do that. And you can kind of choose to put it up here in the scope of Pokemon, or you can put it in the useEffect call. So I could put it, for example, down here as well. In the useEffect or in the function for the useEffect. Doesn't really matter where you put it. The benefit of having it like out here is that if you do use it in multiple places outside of this useEffect, for example, but within Pokemon still, you can at least have that access to it in multiple places. If you are only using it in one place, it probably makes sense to keep it as local as possible. So like in this case, it probably would make sense to put it like right here because I am not using it anywhere else. And I can make sure that if I'm looking up here at the top of the component where we traditionally put all the state and things like that, I know that I don't have to worry about that. I can get to it when I need to get to it, and it's not like part of the rendering or any other types of state that we'll see in the future. So what's happening here is we have the state set up for the image source. We have only our h1 and our image with the source of the attribute of the image actually tracking directly to the state that we have set up. So that's going to change the image tag on render. And we also have our useEffect, which is running on mount, and it's going to call get Pokemon, which is a function that we wrote. You could also do this with .then calls if you don't like the async syntax. And we're going to fetch that URL, turn it to JSON, and grab the actual keys and values that we need, and then set that source for that image tag to cause it to re-render and show us that new image. So if I switch back here, what you should be able to see is very quickly, I guess it changes everything very quickly, but this would have been blank for a split second, and then we actually go out and grab that source, and it fills it in dynamically. So there you go. I hope you found that valuable. That was definitely quite a lot and quite a long video, but these are definitely things that you're going to see all the time when you're working with the useEffect hook and the useState hook kind of in conjunction with each other. And in future videos, we'll see some solutions to these, but this really gives us a nice toolkit already to start building some pretty powerful applications. So if you liked these exercises, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What I've done is also set up a Patreon, YouTube memberships, and super thanks. So if you want to contribute to the channel, those are some methods you can do so as well. What we're going to do in the next video together is go over another hook. There's a whole bunch of hooks that we need to go through called the useRef hook, which is short for use reference. And that's going to allow us to deal with values that we need in state, but we don't actually need it to re-render the components. So we want to be able to keep track of things without the component re-rendering sometimes just as references. And that is what the useRef hook is going to allow us to do, as well as do things like refer to DOM nodes and make things much easier for us, for example, when working with forms and many other cool things. So until that video, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.